Hey, we've got a problem here.
What did you do?
Nothing. I stirred the tanks.
Whoa. Hey.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we have a problem.
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes, and I don't know, it feels like the bad news is kind of starting to pile up for DC Comics. You know, some of it's kind of easy to maybe dismiss out of hand, but once you get enough, you kind of have to take a more serious look at it. Now, obviously, there has been some good news for DC Comics this week. While Future State appears to have been lightly ordered, it's kind of sold out. It's already going on a second printing, and it's not nearly as as bad as I thought it was going to be. It's pretty average. There's a couple of good things in there, some bad things, but for the most part, I think they're going to be happy with Future State and the reaction. We'll see how it goes as far as Infinite Frontier, but obviously there's been a lot of changes at DC Comics recently, and just within the last few days, Jason Fabok was putting some original art out on Instagram. I know a lot of people thought he was going to be working on a Batman 3 Jokers sequel series, and he kind of went into it, and he had some, quite frankly, kind of some distressing information that as far as his thoughts on DC Comics and how it's being run now under the new regime. I'm going to get into that. Now, I am going to give a little bit of information beforehand, just some of the stuff that's been said and where it came from, and then we'll get into Jason Fabok and then my overall thoughts. Now, before I break this all down, I do want to say, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please subscribe to Thinking Critical YouTube. Hit the bell for notifications. Give me a thumbs up if you enjoy this video. Thumbs down if you don't. Either way, I definitely want to hear from you guys in the comment section. Are you a little surprised to hear these comments, when I get to them from Jason Fabok? And what do you think about it? Is there enough smoke that there's fire at DC Comics now? Now, we know that DC has laid off a lot of people, a lot of senior staff, a lot of editorial staff. There are rumors that interns are basically the editorial staff. And you can definitely believe that. They're having a lot of production errors. We're seeing margin lines included in the printing. We're seeing entire colors on pages aren't being printed when they're printing on some of these trades. Pretty basic stuff, minimum standard stuff that you should not expect from a major publisher in comic books. And we're seeing those errors. We're hearing a lot of rumblings, a lot of anonymous sources saying, they're preparing for a third wave of firings. And you can kind of dismiss stuff like that as people that maybe have sour grapes, axes to grind. Likely were part of the recent firings at DC Comics from Warner Media. Obviously, the Warner Media firings hit all levels, and DC Comics was a part of that. So you can kind of, maybe the anonymous source that told Ethan Van Sciver that DC wouldn't be publishing physical comics in June 2021. Well, I talked about it here on my channel. There will be a link to the video description. In the video description, if you haven't seen that one, that's not. I'm almost 100% certain, like 99.9% certain that in December 2021, DC Comics will still be printing physical comic books. But then, Brian Hibbs has been very outspoken. He's an influential retailer. He said he doesn't think DC Comics is going to be publishing physical comics in the close future. What does that mean exactly? Does that mean 2021, 2022? But he thinks a lot of the restructuring things that maybe they're not going to be doing that soon. So you're starting to see a lot of smoke, along with the printing errors and everything. It doesn't paint a pretty picture of DC Comics moving forward. But now we're getting somebody that's a little bit more inside. And obviously, Jason Fabok was the artist on Batman 3 Jokers, which is by far and away the best-selling comic book of 2020. This is a huge seller along with Geoff Johns. This was a comic book that was anticipated for a very long time, and we had heard rumors that we were going to be getting a Batman 3 Jokers sequel after the enormous success. I believe the first issue shipped like 300,000 copies, but then when you think about, I think it was $6 or $7 was the price tag on that comic. So it was a money generator. And I think by the time it was the third one, it only had dropped to 200,000. So all three issues sold very well. Geoff Johns and Jason Fabok had both pitched their idea for the sequel to DC. And this is kind of why he put this image out. It's basically a Raven. It's a creator-owned project. And people were like, hey, I thought there was going to be a Batman 3 Joker sequel. And he's like, not now, but maybe in the future sometimes. This is from his Instagram. I don't really have the desire to do crowdfunding because they're asking if it's going to be a crowdfunded comic and put up with printing and selling. I just want to draw and focus on that. But I see the draw towards it. So maybe one day, or a hybrid like a Tony Daniel or Keanu Reeves projects like they did on Kickstarter. But DC is so poorly run that it took 6 months to get back to us on our pitch. So I took work elsewhere. Think about that. Geoff Johns' Jason Fabok, the best-selling comic in the entire industry in 2020, likely shipped close to 1 million comics when all said and done with all three issues, probably more. I mean, think about special comic store, exclusive covers and things like that. They didn't get back to him for 6 months. What does that tell you about like the focus and the direction of DC Comics? We know that they are moving, they're pivoting their focus from the direct market, obviously traditional comic books, into YA, graphic novels, digital comics, things like that. But the best-selling tandem had a sequel to the best-selling book that they are pitching to DC Comics. They didn't get back to him in 6 months. Obviously, we know that Geoff Johns, a writer very well associated with DC Comics, DC characters, probably the most beloved writer of his generation, is doing a creator-owned project at Image Comics called Geiger, and it's with Gary Frank, the artist for Doomsday Clock, and another very well-known DC artist that Geoff Johns has worked with in the past. Now, they are putting out, I believe it's the Batman Earth 1 Volume 3 at the end of the year, but that work is already done. So they're also pivoting their focus. And Geoff Johns and Gary Frank's like, well, never mind, DC. We're going to go over here and look at this. And then Jason Fabok, the artist behind Batman 3 Jokers, is also moving on because DC Comics couldn't take his phone call. They weren't interested in his pitch. I just find that shocking. Just think about that process, the amount of success that they had, the amount of money that they generated for the company, and they didn't get back to him. And it does not paint a pretty picture. Now, he does go further into it. And this is what he said. I guess, people came back to him like, what do you mean it's poorly run? He said, I worked for DC for 10 years, and a majority of that was when the company was run like a well-oiled machine with leadership that loved its creators and trusted them. It wasn't perfect, but there was a sense of trust and a willingness to listen to ideas. When I say the company is run poorly, it's because I've seen it run well for years. I love DC with a passion and want it to succeed. But right now, I don't think it's being run well. And it's okay to say that. Many people working there are saying the same thing. For starters, they fired almost everyone I ever worked for at the company, many of which were passionate about the books and didn't deserve to go. So we have, Jason Fabok being very honest about the current state of DC Comics. Now, I will say this. As somebody that I was in the military for 20 years, change was a constant in my life. Whether, you're always getting a new commander, you're always moving every 2 years, and then, you have presidential elections, and, focus is always changing. Change is not always easy to accept, especially large-scale change, which is exactly what we're seeing at DC Comics. They got rid of a lot of senior staff. Bob Harris is gone. Dan Didio's gone. A lot of people that Jason Fabok would have worked with closely to pitch his ideas and get his comic books published and work with the company. And even more than that, and we know a lot of the editorial staff are gone. So it is likely a shock to the system, to a lot of the people associated with DC Comics. A lot of them they're not employees. They are independent contractors. That's kind of the gig there. Not a lot of exclusive creators that are like employees of the company at DC right now. Obviously the editorial and some of the executives and things like that are, but the creative talent for the most part are independent contractors. They aren't employees. But it would still be a shock to the system. Everything has changed. The culture has changed. And, maybe who you have to go to, who you're bouncing ideas off to get things approved has changed. So you could, you'd be like, well, he just doesn't like change. Likely, like I said, most people don't like change. But we're starting to see so much of these quotes that we're coming up with, and people are saying that DC is fundamentally different. Maybe it's not being run well, and we are seeing evidence of that too. Like I mentioned earlier, there are printings with major errors in them, and it's not just one or two; it's multiple errors in there, and it does not paint a pretty picture, and kind of goes along with what Jason Fabok is saying here. And he's saying also there are a lot of people within the company that have the exact same feeling he does. So I don't know. Me personally, where there's smoke, there's fire. Scott Snyder, still heavily associated with DC Comics, just did Dark Knight's Death Metal. Adjusted the ending to kick off Infinite Frontier, and as I understand, he still has a creative position at DC Comics, even though he's not working on capes. He's got a book at Image Comics right now, Undiscovered Country. He's about to launch another book, which he did a crowdfunder on, called Nocturna, with Tony Daniel as the artist. He's mentioned there's 2 more projects that he's working on, one associated with Jock, one associated with Francis Manupul, 2 creators he's been heavily associated with DC Comics that are going to be independent comics. He's taking his wares elsewhere, even though he's still associated with DC Comics. And you're seeing a lot of these high-profile creators going and finding work elsewhere. And we know they did announce the new creative teams in March. There's a lot of change, not a lot of familiar faces that are in there. So we are seeing a large-scale change. Obviously, a lot of people that's going to make them comfortable. But when you have the artist behind the best-selling comic of 2020 that can't get a call back, saying things aren't being run well, you kind of have to pay attention to that. When you have a retailer like Brian Hibbs, who very influential in the industry, he's the reason that the FOC exists. He does have knee-jerk reactions a lot of the times, and he definitely was not happy with DC Comics. But you need to pay attention to what he's saying. Ethan Van Sciver was an employee with DC Comics for a very long time, also closely associated with Geoff Johns. He's saying things, he's hearing things like that. You kind of have to pay attention to that stuff. And so the smoke is growing, around DC Comics and what they're going to be doing in the future, and whether it's a well-run company now. Obviously, there's been a lot of change. Marie Javins is the new editor-in-chief. Jim Lee is the publisher. Daniel Cherry has been brought in as the general manager. There was never a general manager before. He's basically supposed to be the marketing whiz for DC Comics. Does it feel like there's a marketing whiz for DC Comics right now? That's not what I'm seeing. So he isn't new on the job anymore. He's been there for about half a year. You would have expected to start seeing some changes, and I don't think we've seen anything close to that, from DC Comics. So are the leadership in over their head? Is it just a sea change as far as what they want to do, and they're just getting their act together? We shall see, but Jason Fabok doesn't think it's being run well. It doesn't sound good for the company, and there's certainly a lot of things that people should be paying attention to. So what do you guys think? Are there dark days ahead for DC Comics? I'm starting to think so. Only time will tell, but I will tell you this: I believe it's Wednesday, Perch is going to join me here on the channel. We're going to do the DC Comics forecast for 2021, talking about the best case scenario, worst case scenario, most likely scenario, and you'll have to see what we kind of think about that. The next day we'll do Marvel as well, but I don't know. Is 2021 going to be a good year for DC Comics? Are we looking for bigger and better things heading into 2022? It's got to be concerning at this point. Very concerning. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. I would appreciate it very much. It helps us attract more views for the channel. Subscribe for future commentary, comic book news, and reviews. And don't forget to ring the bell for notifications. If you want to talk comics, movies, and much, much more, you can follow me on Twitter at Wes_from_TC. With that, Salamat Po, and I'm out.